What was it really like to face the relentless Apache warriors on the battlefield? Today, we dive deep into the untold stories and raw eyewitness accounts from one of the most intense and prolonged conflicts in American history, the Apache Wars. From daring raids to desperate last stands, these first-hand voices reveal the courage, strategy, and heartbreak behind the legend. Stay with us as we uncover the truths that history books often overlook, the real voices from the battlefield. Before we begin, please make sure to like and subscribe to our channel, Forgotten History Central, to bolster our channel. Among the Native American tribes, few names struck as much terror as the Apache. However, it was their horses that elevated the Apache into legendary status. They acquired horses through trade and were skilled scouts, though they were not as eager as some to use this tactic. With such strategies, the Apache became one of the most dreaded groups on the southern plains. Their raids were aggressive and swift, carried out with bows, clubs, and packs of trained dogs. These raids followed a specific pattern aimed at securing supplies rather than seeking battles. Women were involved, and captured warriors could expect torture. Their objective was victory, not honor. Originally, the Apache were nomadic hunter-gatherers. Their raids were designed to be quick and as brutal as necessary. If their targets resisted strongly with bows, the Apache might withdraw, but this was rare. By 1600, Apache horsemen constantly harassed Spanish settlements. They appeared on the plains around 1500 and remained feared for centuries. Typically, raiding parties were small, rarely exceeding a few dozen men, relying on speed rather than numbers. Warfare was harsh, and the Apache were no exception. Killing prisoners and abusing captives were common. Some Apache groups transitioned to farming, but most maintained their nomadic traditions. It was considered acceptable to attack enemies who were down or surrendering, as the goal was survival rather than honor. Allies often rushed into raids, increasing chances for glory. The Apache ranged across what is now Mexico, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, where they were formidable neighbors to other native groups. When Spanish troops arrived, the Apache preferred to avoid prolonged conflict. They quickly learned to ride horses and fight effectively from horseback. Contact with Pueblo peoples and Europeans led some Apache to settle, but most remained nomadic. Apache raids were swift strikes on enemy camps, with quick, lethal attacks, followed by immediate withdrawal. They never lingered or claimed the sites. They chose targets carefully and avoided unnecessary fights. However, their dominance was eventually challenged by the Comanche, who swept in from the north after 1700. Similar to the Apache, they excelled in horsemanship, which made them skilled raiders. The rivalry between the Apache and the Comanche was fierce, with bands from both sides frequently clashing over territory. Yet, the Comanche proved superior riders and pushed the Apache off the plains into mountainous and hilly regions. Apprentices had to survive 4 raids to be recognized as full warriors, granting them the right to join future raids, marry, and have a say in tribal matters. By age 14, a well-trained boy was as formidable as a soldier. Training included games that taught warrior skills, such as creep and freeze, where boys practiced sneaking up on each other and standing perfectly still when spotted. This method was effective both against playmates and American soldiers. Running and swimming were also part of their regimen, enhancing their natural fitness from a nomadic lifestyle. Submission to elder warriors' wisdom was essential for survival and education. Boys learned to shoot bows and slings early, adding clubs and lances as they grew older. One scholar noted a favorite training exercise involved holding water in the mouth to teach breathing through the nose. Apprentices also practiced drinking through special tubes and scratching themselves with sticks to build endurance and discipline. The Apache found themselves caught in political upheaval by the 19th century. They initially supported Texas during its war for independence, fighting alongside Texans against the United States over control of Texas. However, After Texas was annexed by the U.S. in 1845, waves of American settlers encroached on Apache lands. The Apache fought fiercely against these settlers, but Americans viewed them as a barbaric native group to be removed. Peace was no longer an option. The Comanche's horsemanship was less advantageous in mountainous terrain, allowing the Apache to resist more effectively there. Despite this, the Apache were gradually pushed into the mountains and hills. Their intense rivalry with the Comanche and the pressures from expanding American and Mexican territories shaped their history and survival strategies. The Apache Wars lasted 4 decades, involving the U.S. and various Apache bands. Each group had its own tale. Some sought peace at times, while others continued relentless conflict. When Americans attempted to withdraw, they often found Apache warriors already positioned along the ridgeline behind them. Of the 60 American dragoons engaged in one battle, 22 were killed and 23 seriously wounded. The Apache would quickly identify their enemy and set up ambushes on foot, waiting until the Americans believed they had outnumbered them and began to retreat. One favored Apache tactic was cutting the copper telegraph wires used by the U.S. and replacing the severed sections with dried rawhide. This disguise blended so well that American forces struggled to locate the breaks. Fighting the U.S. Army was unlike battling other Indians or settlers. The Apache had to raid those who could fight back and acquire firearms, which were becoming more common but limited by ammunition supplies. Only a few Apache confronted small groups of dragoons as they advanced. The Apache combined mounted hit-and-run tactics with sudden charges into enemy lines, releasing a chaotic mix of arrows and gunfire before quickly withdrawing. Their horses allowed them to cover up to 100 miles a day, making it impossible for slower troops to catch them. This mobility created a constant disruptive effect on their foes. On March 30, 1854, approximately 200 Apache warriors lured a U.S. dragoon force into a deadly trap at the Battle of Cieneguilla. Apache war leaders, known for their charisma, led multiple campaigns against U.S. forces, earning a fierce reputation. The Apache used their horses primarily for scouting, carefully selecting targets like officers and scouts to maximize impact. Although bows and lances remained dominant weapons into the 19th century, firearms and ammunition became increasingly important objectives during raids. Horses were essential for travel and quick escapes, though they lost their role as primary combat tools. The Apache devised many methods to harass larger forces, such as ambushing through canyons and feigning retreats to lure enemies into deadly fire. Over the course of these conflicts, the shortcomings of Apache tactics became clear. After being wrongly accused of raiding in 1861, Cochise emerged as the first of the great Chiricahua leaders before others. Future Apache leaders, such as Vittorio and Geronimo, learned from this lesson. They understood that weapons were only obtained on the black market or through raids, creating a vicious cycle. The Apache were forced to raid in order to acquire arms, which were necessary both for raiding and defending themselves. The Apache chiefs eventually agreed to settle on reservations rather than continue fighting a losing war. However, Cochise carefully avoided direct confrontations, knowing such battles would lead to devastating losses. Guerrilla warfare and swift raids were the only viable tactics, as the Apache were often a generation behind in weaponry compared to the U.S. forces. Vittorio, an Apache war chief, led 80 warriors out of the Ojo Caliente reservation to evade an American plan to relocate them to Arizona. By then, the Apache realized they faced a stark choice: fight to preserve their way of life or surrender to the slow erosion of their culture on the reservations. Vittorio chose to resist, and for the next 14 months, his band roamed across Texas and Mexico, armed with rifles and mounted on horseback. They represented the culmination of centuries of Apache warfare. The Apache excelled in ambush tactics and lightning raids that had served them well in the past. However, they were unprepared for the increasing firepower of the U.S. Army, which now included artillery and cannons. This technological edge, combined with the growing number of troops, made direct engagements more dangerous. At the Battle of Apache Pass in July 1862, Cochise's men suffered heavy casualties and were forced to retreat, a humbling experience. By the 1870s, most Apache warriors owned rifles, often Springfields or Winchesters, which they used effectively in ambushes. Despite this, the imbalance of power seemed insurmountable to many. The Americans and Mexicans had adapted to Apache tactics, learning that chasing them down was futile. Instead, they chose to wait out the Apache, hoping to end the conflict without unnecessary losses. The Americans sent thousands of extra troops to guard every oasis, trading post, and reservation. In 1885, Geronimo escaped one last time with a band of 30 warriors. Their stealth, which had always made the Apache so formidable, now only allowed them to harass undefended targets. Thousands of U.S. soldiers made them little more than a nuisance. Had this been 200 years earlier, hunting bison could have sustained Vittorio's group, but by then the bison population was less than 1% of its former size. Many of his men began to desert. Thanks to the autumn rains, Vittorio's band found a natural sanctuary surrounded by 3 rocky hills. When the smoke cleared on the morning of October 15th, Vittorio and most of his warriors were dead. They had fought until their last bullets were spent. It was a Mexican force that finally tracked Vittorio down with about 150 warriors at Tres Castillos in northern Mexico in October 1880. Vittorio's death at that battle marked a symbolic moment. He had lost his mother, wife, and 3 children to a massacre by Mexican troops in 1851. Geronimo's warriors were among the finest Apache ever produced, masters of firearms and guerrilla warfare, exhibiting incredible speed and skill, using rocks to create natural fortifications against the Mexicans. But the same tactics that once made the Apache feared across the southern plains were no longer enough. The growing number of American settlers had claimed most of the land, and the days of roaming and raiding freely were over. Vittorio was reduced to minor raids on isolated farms and settlements, actions that angered his enemies more than they sustained his people. The U.S. had too many troops and overwhelming firepower for a single band of 30 men to pose a real threat. Vittorio could not attack any important targets without risking an ambush. It was exactly the kind of fight he had tried to avoid. Though American forces deployed extensively to find them, Geronimo's men remained elusive. However, the tactics that once guaranteed their survival were no longer enough to overcome the overwhelming odds. The Apache fought fiercely, but were forced into a desperate holdout, their way of life slipping away. Unable to secure the food or ammunition he required, Geronimo fled south into Mexico with his men gradually abandoning him, much like Vittorio before him. The stories of their warrior past have since become part of history, their speed, horsemanship, and guerrilla tactics making them legendary, though ultimately insufficient. A few Apache raids were reported as late as 1924, but these were isolated events with no significant impact. Most Apache warriors realized they were fighting for a way of life that was no longer sustainable. The Apache Wars came to an end not with a grand victory for either side, but with the simple surrender of a weary old man and a small band of warriors. When U.S. representatives finally made contact with Geronimo in 1886, there was no reason to continue the conflict. The Apaches either settled on reservations or gradually integrated into American society. Even their former enemies remember the Apache's warrior heritage. The U.S. military honors this legacy by naming attack helicopters after Native American groups, including the Apache. In 2011, a new version of the Apache helicopter was unveiled, carrying a tradition of respect for these fierce warriors. The Apache blessing given at the helicopter's unveiling symbolizes the enduring pride in their warrior past, a history still honored by the Apache people today. The Apache Wars may have ended over a century ago, but the echoes of those battles still resonate today. What do you think truly shaped the fate of these fierce warriors, their tactics, their spirit, or the unstoppable forces against them? Share your thoughts below, and let's uncover together the untold stories that history left behind. If you found these real voices from the battlefield as powerful as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to join us on more incredible journeys through history.